Wah, Science in Pajamas! Alright, so today for my bio kids, we're going to talk about the last thing that we were discussing before we went into social distancing. And that is asexual reproduction. So, asexual reproduction is when an organism essentially makes a clone of itself naturally. So, it makes offspring that are genetically identical to itself. The way this is different from sexual reproduction is when you have sexual reproduction, you have an exchange of genetic material in order to get genetically unique offspring. Well, with asexual reproduction, there is no exchange of genetic material, which is why the offspring are genetically identical. And there are three main ways that we mentioned that this can occur. First way would be binary fission. Now, this is essentially just a fancy way to talk about cell division and mitosis for single-celled organisms. Remember, we said when your cells go through mitosis, you have one skin cell, it divides, it becomes two skin cells. But what if you are an organism that is only made up of one cell, like our cute little bacteria here? When the bacteria goes through mitosis and it divides and becomes two cells, we now have two bacteria cells. So that is one way that they can reproduce asexually. So binary fission means that we have one organism, it splits into two because of cell division. The next way is budding. Now this is, we see it in yeast. You can also see it in things like certain corals or sea sponges. And what happens is, here we have our happy little yeast. And then it starts getting a little growth on it. That growth is actually forming into another version of it. And then when that little growth gets to a certain size, it breaks off and is now a new separate organism. Now we mean new in that we have two of them. It is genetically identical to this guy. He's just younger and it'll grow bigger and then it'll be just like that guy. So we call it budding because it kind of grows off of a larger organism and then breaks off and becomes its own. The last one that we were talking about is fragmentation, also known as regeneration. We see this in plants. We see this in some invertebrates. The case in our notes that we shared was Planarius, this little tiny flatworm. And when the flatworm gets cut into pieces, here is showing that it's cut into 7 pieces, each piece will become its own planaria. So each one will grow to be its own individual organism. It is still genetically identical, but we went from 1 planaria to 7 planaria. So that is why it's asexual reproduction. Now, not all organisms can do this. Earthworms can do it up to a certain number of times based on where you cut them because they actually have multiple hearts. So if you cut and each segment has a heart in it, it can regrow into its own new organism, its own separate earthworm. A lot of times we also can talk about how starfish, they lose an arm, they can regenerate, they can grow it back. There have also been a few cases where if the starfish is cut in half, it can regenerate and make 2 starfish. So that's what we mean by fragmentation or regeneration. Now we also mentioned that you can do this with plants. One of the big examples is bananas. The Cavendish bananas, the ones that we typically think of as bananas, the ones we buy from the grocery store. Those, I don't know if you notice this, but as a fruit, they should have seeds. And when you bite into it, you can see like that little star shape. That's where the seeds would be, but the seeds have been bred out because it's sweeter when the seeds are not there. So how we get more plants of that is we fragment. We cut a clipping off of an existing plant, and then we can plant it somewhere else, and it'll grow into a whole new plant. This was also what can occur with potatoes. You might have heard the potato has the eyes and you bury it, it grows into a new potato plant. Well, that's what's going on. It's fragmentation. And that also occurred in Ireland way back when. But this is also, it's good and bad. Good because you can make a lot of plants with minimal work, because sometimes it's hard to fertilize the plants and then get the seedlings going and then get those full size. It takes time and effort. But fragmentation, it shortens that time and effort quite significantly. However, now you have a whole bunch of plants that are genetically identical to each other. So if some kind of parasite or infection comes around that one is susceptible to, they're all susceptible to it. And that is essentially what happened with the Great Potato Famine in Ireland way back when. Is that there was an infection that the potatoes were very, very highly susceptible to. And since a lot of them were created by fragmentation, many of them were affected, and it completely tanked the economy because all the potatoes died. There were no potatoes. So it can have these large-scale effects as well. Now, there is some concern of that happening with the bananas. We'll see if it does. Hopefully, we'll maybe start introducing some biodiversity. See, this is why biodiversity is important, because even within a species, genetic diversity allows for a lot of benefits to come in, such as resistance to different infections and parasites and fungus and bacteria and viruses. So it's a good thing. Bad thing and good thing. Anyways, so binary fission, budding, fragmentation. I have one more example of fragmentation, but this is a personal one. So here I have what's called a jade plant. So that's my jade plant. It used to be bigger, but it did not do well this past winter. I got it as a clipping 10 years ago. Now I am trying to regrow it from another clipping. See that little guy right there? That is a clipping that I took off and replanted about 3-4 months ago, give or take. And it's doing well. And over time, it'll grow into its own plant. It is genetically identical to the bigger one. All I did was a piece had broken off. I cleaned up where it had broken. And then I repotted it. And now I have my own secondary little plant. So that's what we're talking about with fragmentation and regeneration. So I hope that helps clarify the last section that we discussed. If you have any questions, definitely hit me up in email or Google Classroom. But until then, stay healthy.